Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your patience, or I think we're just into afternoon now. So thank you to the organisers and thank you to the leaders of the Public Squares Initiative for the opportunity to give this talk today. And I'm going to be talking on the topic of stakeholder mapping. And I'm Gill Black. I am an engaged research specialist, and I'm also director at the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation, which is a not-for-profit research and engagement company based in Cape Town. So today's seminar comprises three core elements. First of all, what is stakeholder engagement and why is it important in research? Secondly, some useful methods for identifying key stakeholders. And thirdly, building effective stakeholder partnerships. So the first element is what is stakeholder engagement and why is it important in research? So who are the stakeholders in your research? Stakeholders are people or organisations who have an interest in your research project or who affect or are affected by its outcomes. Stakeholders include both those who are supportive of your research as well as those who may be less supportive or indeed critical of it. And it's important to bear that in mind as we go through the presentation today. To me. Camera on. Okay. Okay, that's fine. So a stakeholder doesn't have to be a direct user of the intervention being developed in order to be influenced or affected by it or its outcomes. And so this wide definition stakeholder can include anybody who is directly or indirectly impacted by a research study. So you can have multiple stakeholders in your research, and the image shown here is a visual representation of potential stakeholders in a global health research project. And this image has been drawn from one of the resources that I used in putting this presentation together today. And it's a group called Respire, which is an international primary care respiratory group. And have put together this really, really useful resource. And this is just a nice image showing like a visual representation of stakeholders in a potential global health research study. So we have patients and caregivers, community members and leaders, healthcare providers, members of the general public, civil society organisations, and so on. So quite a broad representation of different types of stakeholders there. So mapping stakeholders and bringing on board the most relevant actors in your research study is the first step to wider stakeholder engagement. And stakeholder engagement is an iterative two-way process of involving and working with relevant stakeholders to achieve mutually agreed outcomes around your research study and its translation into policy or practice. So being able to identify your key stakeholders, determine mutual benefits and goals of working together, and to do this right from the very start of your research project can yield many advantages, and it's vital for the meaningful and impactful engagement of your study. So even if it's not always possible to involve stakeholders right from the start, do look for chances to do so as soon as you have the resources available. So some useful methods for identifying key stakeholders. So there are three crucial stages in stakeholder mapping. And by following these stages, you can ensure that your research questions are developed based on local priorities, context, and the needs of the study beneficiaries. And so you need to firstly identify who your stakeholders are. You need to then analyze those stakeholders, and then you need to prioritize them. So I'm just going to go through those three steps. So stage one is to identify your potential stakeholders. And so you need to consider any stakeholders, and these can be either individuals or groups that are affected by your research study and may be interested in its outcomes. And this can be a really long list. And it's very important if you want to do an inclusive and comprehensive stakeholder mapping process, it's very important to adopt an inclusive approach and really consider everybody who is potentially going to affect or benefit from your study. So some of the helpful questions that can help to inform a list of potential stakeholders are: who will benefit from this research study? Who holds the most power within your research system? Who does not have significant power but can still be affected by your study? Who can contribute to the different stages of your study? Who could block your study? And who can be affected by its outcomes? And who can use its outcomes? So in identifying potential stakeholders, this is a very useful list of questions to be thinking about as the first stage of your stakeholder mapping process. And at the same time, as you're identifying these stakeholders, you should be asking yourself, how will engaging with these stakeholders be beneficial for your research? It's not just about benefit to the stakeholders, but it's about benefit to your research by engaging with these stakeholders. So, for example, just looking at this table here, community members and leaders. So benefits of having community members and community leaders as stakeholders in your project is that they can help you to determine local priorities and support you in developing your ideas. They can facilitate community support, which can often be absolutely fundamentally important for the success of a research project. They can support with recruitment, and they can also help to disseminate research evidence widely as it's generated. Another example of an important stakeholder could be a scientific advisory board. They can strengthen the credibility and rigor of your research. They can provide strategic guidance. They can help you identify potential pitfalls, and they can also facilitate the integration of interdisciplinary perspectives and innovative approaches. So the examples of stakeholders here are, again, drawn from the previous diagram that we looked at: general public, civil society, policymakers, government authorities, security services. Perhaps you're working in dangerous areas. Perhaps you need to think about having security services as stakeholders in your research process, service providers, manufacturers, funding agencies, and so on. And so this is how to think really quite in depth about who your stakeholders are, and also to think about how your research is going to benefit from having this array of stakeholders involved in your study or engaged in your study. So along with identifying the stakeholders that you need for your research, you also have to determine where you're going to find them from. And this can be more obvious, obviously, for some stakeholders than it is for others. And ways of identifying stakeholders are, well, you can quite simply consult with your own team or experts in the field. You can meet with community members, gatekeepers, massage your personal networks, use a snowballing approach, ask existing stakeholders to recommend additional stakeholders, and also do a review of published and grey literature. So the next step 2, is to analyze. So once you actually have what you think is your full list of stakeholders that you want to engage in your research project or your research program, the next step is to analyze them, and analyze them specifically for their needs and concerns. So how can and how does your research project address their needs or concerns? So again, if we take affected community members as our first group of stakeholders in a research study, what do they need? Well, they need information and they need skills building to support the management of the challenge at local level. And what are their concerns? Their concerns are that the services that they need or the service that's being tested perhaps is far away from their homes, and as a result could result in costly travel and loss of wages. And so this is the next stage is really to analyze, okay, we've got our stakeholders, we understand how they could benefit, we understand how we could benefit from having them on board, but now let's go to the next stage and really understand how our research can address their needs and concerns and therefore motivate those stakeholders to stay engaged with our study. And we have them as stakeholders because they're important to our work. Okay, and analysing stakeholders in this way can help you to gain insight on how you might approach them, how you can influence them to get involved, and how you can tailor your engagement based on the stakeholder priorities. Because you may really need to have particular groups or organizations involved in your research project in order for it to be successful, but you may also have never worked with them before, and they may also be people who could potentially block or have issues with your research. So it's really important for you to, before you approach a stakeholder that is potentially going to be tricky or difficult to get on board, to think about, well, what do they need from our research and what concerns do they have? And therefore, if we want to convince them to come on board and be a stakeholder in our study, how are we going to approach them and what are we going to say in terms of what our research can do for them? So again, you can discuss with your research team or your consortium about these needs and concerns, consult with experts, and communicate with the stakeholders themselves. So the third step is prioritization. Okay, so and one of the very well used tools that you will see again and again and again in stakeholder mapping resources is this power interest grid. And prioritizing which stakeholders to engage with and to what extent is also crucial, because you can't give the same effort and energy to all of your stakeholders. You may have a list of 50 and you may have a relatively small research team and a relatively small budget, but you have to in some way engage with all of those 50 stakeholders in order for your research to be successful. So this grid here is used as a way to help researchers prioritize who are the most important stakeholders that they need to engage with and where are they going to put their effort and energy. And so using this grid, you can categorize stakeholders into one of 4 quadrants, and this can help you to determine the most pragmatic approach to how you're going to actually engage with them. So there are lots and lots of different versions, as I said. There are a lot of different stakeholder mapping resources out there, and there are many different versions of this particular grid. Most of them have the aim of evaluating potential stakeholders in terms of their importance, their influence, their interest, and their investment in the research activities and the trajectory of your research. So you can use this to visually organize your stakeholders according to their power or influence. And the interest is interchangeably used with impact in many of the examples of this grid that you will see out there online, for example. So what this means is that the level of interest that a stakeholder has in your research is likely to be related on how much it will impact them, either directly or indirectly. So you will see, in some cases, you will see this grid with the word interest of stakeholders, and in some you will see it as impact of research. And essentially, it boils down to the same thing when you're weighing up power versus interest / impact. So here's an example. Again, this was taken from the Respire resource, which I'll share with you towards the end of the talk in more detail. And here they talk about high power, low impact, high impact. And you can see here that if you have a high, if you are mapping in your stakeholder mapping process, if you identify a stakeholder, a key stakeholder, as somebody who has high power but has low impact, then these are likely to be opinion formers who need to be satisfied with what's happening, although they may not wish to be actively engaged in your study. So this could be, for example, somebody in a local government department who is a real gatekeeper in terms of you being able to test an intervention through that your research is generating or formulating. But they themselves may not be impacted by your study, and therefore their own personal interest is going to be quite low. So this is just an example of a high power or low impact stakeholder that you would map on your grid. And we're in the workshop this afternoon, we're going to be using this grid, and we're going to be doing some of this mapping to enable you to think more closely about who your stakeholders are and where you would put them on the grid if you were using this process for stakeholder mapping. So a high power, high impact, these are stakeholders who are interested in your study and have the power to change things. And this group really needs to be fully engaged throughout the planning and implementation of your study. Then you have the low power, low impact or low interest groups. So they need to be monitored for their reactions, but they're a low priority if you don't have much time, you don't have much resources, and you're stretched in this aspect of your research. Your engagement is stretched in this aspect of your research. And then you've got your low power and high impact. So these stakeholders might have no power, but they could be very highly impacted by your study. And so they should be consulted because they can provide both important experience and insights as well as feedback on your study. So it's really important if you're using this power impact matrix to regularly review it and update it as new stakeholders enter your landscape or move between, they could move between different quadrants. So your stakeholder matrix is unlikely to stay static. It's likely to change as your research moves along its trajectory. So somebody who may have a low impact at the very beginning of your study could be very, very important and have high impact or high power at the end of your study. So it's just a case of if you're using this method to make sure that you are regularly reviewing it and updating it. And so that means that you'll then have to change your approach to engagement with that stakeholder, and you're probably going to have to revise your plan. If you don't have anybody in your high power, high impact quadrant, then you have to think again, because then it's very likely that there's a key stakeholder that's missing from your list of stakeholders. And then finally, the third element is building effective stakeholder partnerships. And so this, in all your interactions, when you're mapping your potential stakeholders, it's really important for you to provide a clear explanation of your study and its implications. You need to emphasize the role of stakeholder engagement in achieving the broader objectives of your research study. And this could include, for example, incorporating the lived experiences of affected people, improving service delivery, influencing community level knowledge and behaviours, enhancing practice and contributing to policy reform. So it's very important to discuss the benefits and the potential risks of becoming involved as a stakeholder, and to ensure stakeholder agreement for participation in the study. And this includes the way in which engagement will happen and how and when you will engage with that particular stakeholder group throughout your study. So in terms of building effective stakeholder partnerships and key principles of stakeholder engagement, well, first and foremost is respect, and being respectful is obviously central to developing successful relationships. It involves active listening, it involves empathy, noting and understanding what people are saying and how they're expressing themselves, regardless of your own views and values as a researcher. A shared commitment among researchers and stakeholders to the continuous and sustained engagement and relationship building. Consensus, working towards mutual understanding and priorities, and working towards mutual views and motivations will help to reach consensus around decision making and will help to build stronger partnerships. Striving for ethical integrity, promoting the well-being of your stakeholders, preventing any harm or risks to them, and incorporating lessons that have been learned to improve engagement and intended outcomes. They should be, this will all strengthen the ethical integrity of your stakeholder engagement. Accountability, ensuring accountability will involve providing regular feedback to your stakeholders on how their interests and views are actually being addressed, how their contributions are impacting the research study, and also following up on commitments that you have made to them through your engagement activities. And then institutionalization, and this means essentially to embed stakeholder engagement into organizational practice. And so this means that the necessary financial resources need to be dedicated, need to have staff, plans, rewards, and all of this makes it possible to practice stakeholder engagement across all research studies. And for transdisciplinary research to be effective and to be meaningful, then the institutionalization of stakeholder mapping and stakeholder engagement is going to be and is absolutely crucial. So the process of stakeholder mapping can be incredibly complex and in-depth. The most important thing, obviously, is how it's going to be useful to you. So you may not need to do a particularly in-depth process, but then as you start to look at the resources that are available for stakeholder mapping, you realize it can become a very in-depth and complex and time-consuming business, and that you need to have the right amount of time built into your research program and the right people involved in your research program to be able to do it effectively and meaningfully. So, for example, there's this website here, the new Levo, and that it provides a whole array of different templates that you could use for your stakeholder mapping process. And in one of the resources that I looked at while I was putting this presentation together, it was called Tractivity, and again, I'm going to share that with you just now. They talk a lot about attitude. So we were earlier on looking at, people who are can potentially be critical of your research, people who can potentially block your research. I mean, these are, some of the most important stakeholders that you'll ever encounter. And so the Tractivity spends time saying that matrix, the power influence matrix, or the power interest matrix, can also be used to examine the attitudes of your stakeholders. So those people that you are most concerned about in terms of their attitude towards your research are potentially going to be stakeholders, individuals or groups that you really need to spend a lot of time convincing if they're critical to your work, and to then thinking through your process of actually engaging and your approach to actually engaging with them and bringing them on board and getting buy-in for your study. So it can go as in-depth and complex as you need and want it to be, as long as it's actually obviously adding value to your research process. So just going through some of these resources then. So this was a very, very useful one. It also contains some very nice case studies. So Stakeholder Engagement in Global Health Research, a resource guide. And what I really want to emphasize at this point is that most of the stakeholder mapping resources that are out there are lend themselves to research topics generally. So this particular guide can be used for a whole range of different research topics and research themes. It's not only useful for health or global health in terms of how it helps you to think about not only stakeholder mapping, but the whole process of stakeholder engagement. And then this was the tractivity one, which was also really well put together guide. And this is the one where they kind of pay a bit more attention to stakeholder mapping in terms of looking at the attitudes of your stakeholders and how important that is. And then thirdly, there's this resource, which is a course which has just very recently been made available via the Global Health Network. And this course is an introduction and practical guide to community engagement and involvement in global health research. It is a 7-module course, and it's all about engaging community in a research process. And again, it can be applicable to many different research topics and themes. And module 2, which is justifying engaging community, considering stakeholders and engaging policymakers, is a really useful module in terms of stakeholder mapping and stakeholder engagement. And so is module 6, which is partnerships, relationships and project planning. And then just finally, these three papers here. Well, the first 2 papers are actually more of an academic analysis of stakeholder mapping processes, and then thirdly, a really nice blog, which is available there through that final link on the IIASA website. So that's it. We want to questions or clarifications.
Just, maybe just a general, I mean, what you have presented is, I would say, that ideal, if researchers can actually achieve that. Yeah. But we know that in practice, there's time issues, there's institutional constraints, there's timing issues. That's not easy to achieve this in practice. In my experience, with researchers. Your first one, affected. Research plan that's really conceptualized. Now you want to buy
Okay, I might have to ask you to repeat the third question. There's a little bit of a technical thing going on there. But for your first question, So the process of stakeholder mapping, first and foremost, has to be valuable to your research. You have to not only want to do it, but you have to need to do it in order for it to be worth the time and effort that you put into it. And I think probably the larger the research project, the more important it is to do stakeholder mapping.
Would you, when you say you need to do it, you should convince that the researchers or funders?
Well,
if it's not done,
yeah,
it's honest about research.
Yeah. Yes, a lot of research happens without it. But I think if you're doing implementation science, then stakeholder mapping and stakeholder engagement may become, you know, rather than when you're doing kind of primary research, then maybe your stakeholder mapping isn't such a vital part of what you're doing. But when you're going on to implement your research findings, or you're going on to implement interventions that you have discovered through your research process, then you may need to buy in of a lot more stakeholders. So it's a very general concept, and it's really up to the lead researchers in the research process about whether they need to do it, when they need to do it, how in depth it needs to be, how helpful it's going to be for their research. I think if you were applying for funding and you wanted to implement an intervention, and you had said in your research proposal to your funder that you had done a stakeholder mapping process, and that you'd identified these stakeholders, and you can give them some examples of where where the concerns are around these stakeholders, where the benefits are in engaging these stakeholders, then that could potentially strengthen your research proposal. But of course, some funders may ask for that. Some funders may specifically say they want to see that you've done a stakeholder mapping process, but that is something that may be in the call. What we're looking for is research proposals that have included as a component of stakeholder mapping, for example, just like they often ask it these days for to see that you've thought about community engagement and involvement in your research, which is part of stakeholder engagement. No. Yeah.
You've already decided what research you're going to do. So my question is, shouldn't some of this happen even before you apply for funding?
Yes.
And that is difficult.
Yes.
Don't have to do the engagement. So it's
absolutely.
Like, because once you've submitted the research proposal,
Yeah.
it now means that you want to buy it of the community often.
Yeah. So and again, it's about having the time and having the resources to be able to do it before you apply for funding, and you are more likely to know who your key stakeholders are once you already have the benefit of experience of doing a research project. So it's much more difficult for let's say a new researcher who's starting out on a new research topic to know who their stakeholders are and to map them in this way. But as you become more experienced, as you go deeper with your research, as your research starts to have more traction and more impact, then you will begin to gain knowledge about who your stakeholders are. And as I mentioned in the talk, that can also come through talking to experts and talking to some stakeholders that you already have engaged with, and asking them who else you should be engaging with, talking with your colleagues about who you should be engaging with in your research, in order to make it more effective, but also for your own benefit as a research group. So it's where and when you do it, it is probably a luxury to be able to afford the time to be able to do this. And I think it depends on how much difference that is going to make to your research, how important it actually is. And it's a skill, and it requires knowledge, and it requires practice, and it requires flexibility and adjustment as well as you're going through.
Jill, for transdisciplinary research, we do not say that this is a necessity. I mean, one often makes assumptions when you are, I mean, if you're going to do research that's engaging societal stakeholders as part of a transdisciplinary team, then you need to know who they are. And it makes sense to sit back for a while and just think about who, I mean, often one goes about it intuitively or making assumptions, as I said, but it'd be nice to do it in a methodical way so that you can say, okay, who are the people we really need to speak to? Where are the ones that we think might be some difficulties? Are they really so important to our research? Can we sort of move on without them, or do we really need to find a way to form a partnership? I think if it's a partnership kind of research we're working with outside of the academy, then this is essential. It's not, I don't think it's a luxury.
Were you going to add something? So I just, there are hands going up now, so that's great that we're getting a conversation going. Just in terms of your question about the general public, I think it, again, if engaging with the general public is, yes, in terms of understanding the needs and concerns of the general public, that's a very, very hard thing to do unless you're going to do a massive survey. But perhaps the general public become a more important stakeholder towards the end of your research study, where you're trying to inform people about some very, very important results that you have generated that will impact on their lives. So we've had this incredibly important finding. It's absolutely definite. It's a notifiable finding. The general public needs to know about it. What approach are we going to take to engaging them? Are we going to now have our local radio station as a stakeholder? Are we going to try and get in, the media? How are we going to engage the media in this so that the general population has a chance to find out about this very important finding that we've made that could impact their lives? So it's not like you have to engage all of your stakeholders all at once right at the very beginning of your project. The stakeholders that you need to engage will change and be fluid as you go along. So you may not want to. It's a good idea if you're having a research project that is wants to influence policy and practice, then it's a very good idea to engage your government department, your relevant government department right from the very beginning. But you may decide that, well, actually, you want to have some concrete evidence before you engage with them, because that way you're more likely to convince them that you're onto something important and that they need to now, be involved and come on board and help you in some way with your research process. So it's a fluid, dynamic process, and people will come on and off, and their power and their influence and their interest will change, especially if it's a long program of research, like about 5-year program or something. But I think there's other hands up, Marina, so we can also chat at lunch. Okay. Yes.
Hi. I'm going to say further.
Yeah.
Identifying your stakeholders. So you're conducting focus, and maybe you have to be the legislator as a policy, you've got scientists, academia. And you're conducting supposed to, how do you manage that? How differential when it comes to being able to encourage people to speak and have these kind of debates? Because I feel that certain individuals will be more likely to speak and others will be likely to just listen or not participate. Do you have any recommendations as to how much place them, how them in that session?
So I think there's a lot to be said about having facilitator skill and expertise in those kind of settings, and I would, being somebody who's done a fair amount of community engagement and involvement in research, it's also very, very helpful and effective to do some preparatory work. So rather than taking, say we have affected community members or at-risk community members who are not used to speaking in a public forum. They find it intimidating. Perhaps there are language barriers. Then making time to engage with them through workshop processes, for example, before you take them into a focus group discussion where they're potentially having to, discuss with academics or discuss with policymakers or people in government or, highfalutin bosses in NGOs or something. Work with your community members in advance to help them prepare for what might come up in those focus group discussions, and so that they feel they have knowledge which is important, they have knowledge which is fundamentally important to the conversation and the debate that's going to happen. Again, this may be considered a luxury, but as community engagement and involvement in research becomes more and more of a prerequisite for funding, having those elements built into your research and making time, money, effort, building skills and capacity within your research group to do that is just becoming increasingly important. So I would say spend time, prepare, and build confidence and build belief in people that they actually have something very important to contribute in those focus group discussions. Yeah.
I think that was the it's like an exercise for the research project of the collecting of data and it's a primary data to start. That'd be a research project in and of itself to, for example, focus groups that we have interviews to get those needs and interests if they are not well known or survive. I'm just wondering how do you avoid making assumptions about groups and needs and needs and concerns?
Mm-hmm. So it's a good point, and I think both can be right. So if, as I was saying earlier on, a lot of the value of stakeholder mapping and stakeholder engagement is based on how much experience you have as a researcher in your research field, or how long your project or your program's been running for. If you are starting out from scratch and you've never worked with this particular group of people before, then building that in as a part of your research process would be, you're right, you can't know their needs and concerns. You can make assumptions about their needs and concerns, but that's obviously not ideal. In fact, it's a no-no. So do the research, identify the needs and concerns, and then think about how your research can be expanded, adapted to address those needs and concerns that you have identified through a research process. On the other hand, if you've been doing, you've been in the research field for a long time, you may already have a very good idea of what the needs and concerns are. But that doesn't mean that you say, oh, we know what the needs or concerns are, but then the responsibility is to think about how your research can address those needs and concerns going forward. So there's, again, it's like a long kind of spectrum of where you are in your research, how important it is to do these processes, the value of stakeholder mapping, and whether you need to build in research or whether as part of a stakeholder mapping process. So I think, yeah, both of those could be absolutely valid. Yeah. Donald.
And to pick up on that, what you're saying, often we take very different approaches to different stakeholders that we develop over time. Mm-hmm. But I want to ask you to talk about it more. When you're going in with this kind of work, participatory work, you're often not going from a neutral perspective.
Yeah.
You're going with an agenda and you're going with an approach.
Yes.
Which means you sometimes get into conflict or criticism of your stakeholder.
Yes.
Any recommendations on how to work that through?
Well, I mean, I think that the partnership building part of, you know, that the presentation and the whole kind of spectrum of stakeholder engagement then comes into play. If you really need that stakeholder to be on board in order for your research to be effective and impactful, you need to work at the relationship. And that, again, is going to take time. It's going to take patience. It's going to perhaps require you to reach compromises. And you know, maybe in a situation where a stakeholder is just absolutely, it's a solid no, and it's like a block of steel and you're never going to get through there. But that's, if that's the case, then perhaps they, or you shouldn't, you know, waste your time if you already know that it's an impossible mission to try and convince somebody and think, well, if they're not going to come on board, then who else could we bring on board that may be able to eventually get us where we need to be? Or who else could we get on board that could potentially help us to convince that stakeholder? Because if I can't do it, maybe Astrid can do it, you know, because Astrid's already worked with them and she has a good reputation and they trust and respect Astrid. So if they say, oh yeah, actually, you know, maybe you should listen to Gill, I've known her for a few years or whatever, that can also help. So I think it's just around being willing to take time, being willing to make compromises, and also having the insight of how, if you really need that stakeholder, how you can reach them maybe in a roundabout way.
I think the particular conflicts about the government department, which department would be on,
Yeah.
but you then have to find a way of leaving conflict within the department.
Yeah. It's so, it is very, very difficult to do policy engagement work, and I think that the only way that you're ever going to have any success with that is to be persistent and to keep the relationship, just to keep in touch, keep the thread, keep the door of communication open, and not have like months or even maybe years go by and then expect that person X in the Department of Health is suddenly going to still be your best friend, or, you know, that person who you so relied on previously simply isn't there anymore, and you've got to. So I think if you are doing research that has policy and practice ambitions, then it can't be emphasized strongly enough how you need to maintain that relationship, those communications and those conversations. Even if you haven't got very much to say, just be persistent in your communication and keep them updated every possible moment in your research study, so they're like, you're visible to them, you're on their radar. Yeah.
Just come to that issue. Yes, it's sometimes really tricky to be like really honest with myself, almost about what is your objective really with the engagement.
Yeah.
Is it to be open to criticism and to really be willing to change what you're planning to do? Or is it to get buy-in and support, you know, from the stakeholders?
Yeah.
So, and depending on which way you go, your approach will be very, very different.
Yeah, it's true.
And
Yeah.
I think if you don't know why you're going in there in the first place,
Yes.
and you hover between these two, then you know, things that also go really wrong.
Yeah, I think it's picking up on Astrid's point around transdisciplinary research. I mean, the whole point of this initiative is in the public squares is to obviously foster transdisciplinary research, and within the university and within the 11 public squares groups. And for some of the groups, transdisciplinary research is a new endeavor. And it requires going way out of your comfort zone, away above and beyond anything that you've done before, and building in these capacities and these processes and activities that you may never have had to rely on previously for your research. So, yeah, I think one needs to always lean into the criticism as long as it's constructive. But to do transdisciplinary research and to have, you know, to work beyond the walls of the academy, to have external stakeholders is I mean, yeah, it requires a whole kind of mindset change within the research community. And it's going to be a process of learning as you go along as well. But yeah, I mean, again, it's it's a good question. You know, why are we engaging with these stakeholders? Is it purely for the benefit of the research? Is it for their benefit? Where does that lie? And therefore, how much energy and effort should we actually be putting into it? And how can we maybe improve or engage better with these people so that the relationship becomes more meaningful than just, you know, well, we as a tick box, or this is how we're going to benefit. So yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Satisfy the foundation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that grid, that matrix, that prioritization matrix, then, you know, comes into its own, because it really helps you. You may have this long list, and some of it may be kind of like, you know, a bit of a pipe dream about who you'd like to reach and why. But, you know, that matrix can really help you to prioritize who are the high impact, and high interest, high power people that you really need to be focusing your attention on. And then if you've got the luxury of time and money and the team and everything, then you can extend your reach.
Sure, I think we should see if anyone wants to ask anything about that. And then Karen has a question around or comments. I don't know, assuming we would need to be well aware of the POPIA. We don't just refer to the POPIA Act in the process. So I don't know if Karen.
Sorry.
I don't know. Does anyone online want to say anything? You can pop it in the chat, or
So is that a question?
I don't know. I don't know if I fully understand. Assuming we would need to be well aware of POPPIA. I don't know if it's POPIA Act.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what's it got to do. And come into play.
Well, I think
Hi.
it's
Sorry, can you hear me?
yes.
Yes,
Can I hear you?
Karen. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, it was supposed to be, that was a misspelling. It is the POPIA Act. And I guess it's really around, you know, if you're doing a snowballing exercise to locate your stakeholders, contact details and things like that are shared. And I guess one has to be, I suppose, quite conscious of you know, the databases that you develop or something around that, because, you know, you're going to need to get hold of these stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think it's you'd need to make sure that people's personal identification is protected, that you have, you know, if you have people's names and contact numbers and addresses or whatever, that they are in secured files, that's password protected and all the usual, because it's data. It's a form of data in your research study, so you would protect your stakeholder contact list as much as you would protect your other data. Make sure it's only accessible to certain people in your team, and that it's definitely not or shared or potentially findable by other people. And only use it as is absolutely necessary, and make sure that people that you contact know how you got their information and why you're contacting them, and that, you know, you're not sharing that contact information with anybody else. And then if they want to be taken off, you take them off. That answer the question?
Keegan.
Thanks.
Okay, question. So my understanding of what we're doing includes transdisciplinary approaches.
Mhm.
The different policies that should be there and the public it's taken into account by the government.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely familiar with the literature, but those universities that have studies, have they been open to industry or the public actually making recommendations to the academy as to what they can change in terms of them being able to translate this information effort, and also then having like method of this joint system. Academies come standing by itself, and it's not really really impacting industry and society as much as it could eventually. Is there a symbiotic relationship where we want to change outside the world, but outside the world just has the potential to change?
Yeah. So I think that's exactly why community engagement and involvement, stakeholder engagement more broadly is becoming is growing as a discipline within the research process. It's exactly to make sure that the right research questions are being asked, that research is actually addressing the challenges that people are experiencing, and that it's done in a way which is appropriate in those settings, and that it's going to develop interventions that are actually going to be meaningful. So I think we're at a very, very interesting kind of historical moment in research right now, where the academy is being shaken up a bit, and there is more and more expectation that researchers will be cognizant of external views, external ideas. And yes, there's always going to be a balance to be struck. The ideas, the aspirations, the demands of people outside of the academy may be impractical, may be impossible, but that all requires discussion, debate, and rationales for why something can't be done. And I think it's those processes of engagement and those conversations which are kind of like a new standard for research, and will become elements of research which are fairly new. Yeah. So.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you. Good. Thanks a lot for the
Yeah,
opportunity. Good
yeah,
luck with all your stakeholder mapping.
Yes, yeah.
We'll have some fun with it this afternoon.